Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your patience. We're now opening this session. May I please ask Ali Shafar, Deputy Director of Energy and Climate Change at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to join us on stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this session, which we are very proud to host and organize for the third year with our IRENA and IEA colleagues, as well as REN21, and so many distinguished speakers from the Renewable Energy Advisory Board of the International Energy Agency. Without taking too much away, I believe it's fair to say we can all look forward to an exciting discussion, as usual, in the next few hours. Renewable energy is established, beyond any doubt, as an attractive tool to diversify energy system and to combat climate change. Natural gas is recognized as the cleanest fossil fuel and as such likely to remain a major driver of energy growth in the coming decades. Recent developments, which we all observed in both the renewable and gas markets, call for a debate on their evolving role and the interplay between the two. And globally, we're welcoming the strong political commitment to renewables, to addressing climate change, which is apparent in the adoption of UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. In the first session, experts from across the energy world will share their view on what to expect for 2016 across the world and what it could mean for the region. Next, leading thinkers in energy will focus their attention on the MENA region, providing latest insights on developments relevant to the Middle East and North Africa energy markets, including the evolving role of renewables and natural gas and the latest project developments. At last year's session, someone said that we will look back at 2014 and 2015 as a turning point for renewables. Here in the UAE, we firmly believe that this has happened and that there is more to come in 2016. Let me hand over now to my colleague, Martin Schupe, who will take you through the first session. Thank you, and I hope you all the best in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Dear ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it's a pleasure also to welcome you on behalf of the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, where I head the International Energy Division. I'm also chair of the Renewable Energy Working Party of IEA, and with that, it's a real pleasure for me to invite you to this afternoon session on renewables, climate, natural gas in the MENA region. It is a joint event this afternoon from IEA, from IRENA, from REN21, together with our host country, Masdar, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the United Arab Emirates. The topic is promising, and I do not want to stand any longer in between you and the panelists. I'm proud to announce you first two keynote speakers that set the scene, one from the private sector, one from the international organization, IEA. It's Paulo Frankel. He is head of the Renewables Division within IEA, and it's Paul Nielsen. He is member of the Global Energy Transition Group of PwC. Rabia Firouki, whom you may see in the program, will come at a later moment in the program and will then give her setting the scene presentation at that moment. So with these brief words, energy transition in this region here, what does that mean? What are the prospects based on the huge potential that that region has here? I would first hand over to Paulo. Please, Paulo.
Excellent. So I know I need to be quick. I needed to be quick already before, now it's even more. So no introduction. Let's start immediately. 2015 may be a real tipping point, and I will try to say why, and maybe even the title of a new energy era. The first is, of course, COP21 is no less than an historic agreement. The historic change started before COP21 with the INDCs, because it's the first time ever that so many countries really sit down and had to write a strategy to decarbonize. The second point, in 2015, we had the lowest price ever announced for wind and PV. And the third, however, we had also the lower prices for all fossil fuels. We speak a lot of oil, of course, in this region, but we don't need to forget gas and also coal, which is at minimal prices and which could stay at low prices for longer time. So maybe this is really the start of a new era with a number of implications. Now, the first thing is the cost. Someone in the plenary said, yes, it's a paradox, oil is dropping faster than solar. Yes, but for how long and since when? You have to compare the cost, and I'm afraid I don't have a good slide with the oil cost here, but you have to compare the fossil fuel prices with the cost of renewables for a longer period. And what is certainly sure that there was a massive decrease of, in particular, wind, solar PV, both for rooftops and utility scale, and what is most important is that these will continue in the future. And where do we have the best results? We have the best results where you have a combination of price competition, long-term contracts, and of course, expansion in markets with new good resources. Now, I don't want to go very much in detail in this map, but we are trying to capture in a map what the announced contract prices for long-term auctions or long-term remuneration schemes, it can be even a feed-in tariff still, for wind and PV. And I remember clearly the PV Dubai deal was announced here at the conference last year, and some people said this will not be replicated anytime soon anywhere. Now, my main message here, without getting into the details, is it's getting in all parts of the regions, and we have a great difficulty in tracking this map. This map is incomplete. It has not the results of Morocco. But what I want to emphasize is the three lowest record prices are in the MENA region, precisely here in Egypt and in Morocco. And this is a signal, however, for the whole world. Now, COP21 as a motor for acceleration. I want to repeat it. The INDCs by themselves are a historic change. However, we know this is not enough. They are not going to peak the emissions. And the first thing to be done is to make sure that we have an early peaking, like it is written in the Paris Agreement. And this can be done, in our opinion, to accelerate investments in energy efficiency, in renewables, but also doing other things. Phase out inefficient coal, look at upstream methane reductions, and of course, make progress in the fossil fuel subsidy reform. And then also keep in mind that to go to 2 degrees and even more below 2 degrees, we will need much more innovation. And not just innovation at the single technology level, but the system optimization level. And I will insist on that. The crucial challenge is to optimize the overall systems and to look at the portfolio of renewables in that optimized system. Now, when we published our market report in October, we showed this graph that many did not like. We warned at that time that there were 3 factors that could stall the growth, the annual growth of renewable capacity. The 3 factors were policy uncertainty, in particular in Europe and at that time in the US, grid interconnection issues in countries like China, South Africa, in many places, but also Japan, and third, access of financing in developing countries. We also said, however, that policies, good policies, could change this picture and get back to the track of the linear growth of markets over years, which will mean an exponential growth of cumulative markets, and this would be in track with the 2 degrees goals. Now, in 3 months after our projections, 1 month after COP, I'm glad to say that half of this is done. And if I want to pick one example, it's something that for me is also historic, the extension of the PTC in the United States with an incredible long length of 5 to 6 years, which gives 6 or 7, which gives business the right time to adapt their business strategies. And this is only one example. Mexico auctions, France, probably the China targets which will increase, half of that is done. We think that with India coming on board and with the materialization of the many pledges and announcements done at COP21, very quickly we will be again in our accelerated transition. Now, on geography, I want just to stress that while in the past renewables grew a lot in Europe, United States, in Japan, in the future the big part of the growth will come from somewhere else. This somewhere else is first of all China, and then other countries, Brazil and India. The MENA region, this is a graphic problem, I didn't want to overemphasize, but anyway, this is 2%, and then the rest of the non-OECD world. This is something to be absolutely taken in mind, because one has to look at these markets as the motor of growth and see what the barriers and what the right policies are in those markets. And you will discuss much more in detail the regional situation, also with the presentation of Rabia afterwards. Let me show just one slide. Worldwide, renewables are set to dominate the net capacity additions, not in the long-term future, starting from now over the next 5 years. Worldwide, it's almost 2/3, and in OECD countries, taking into account the retirement, so the concept of net capacity, 100% of power capacity additions will be renewables. Don't forget that. In Europe, United States, taking into account the retirements, this is 100%. Now, in this region, this is not exactly the same. So there is a lot of announcement. This needs to be anchored in the ground with real policies, with real action. The potential is there. I look forward to hearing much more about this in the coming discussion and in the what follows. Now, I will conclude on that slide on what are the necessary policies in this new situation. In the past, the cost reduction in deployment was policy-driven and basically driven by technology, learning, and scale up, and this kind of virtuous cycle. In the future, what really matters is no longer high economic incentives, but the right policy and regulation that attract and the right market rules that reduce financing costs and enhance the competitiveness of renewables. So, of course, technology innovation will continue, but it will be much more a question of financial innovation and expansion in new markets that have the best resources. And in our opinion, the key three main characteristics of this new policy paradigm is, first, get the rules right, the right regulatory and the market design to attract financing. This means fostering competition. It has to have predictable long-term remuneration that attract financing, but it also has some kind of short-term price signal that gives the signal we need to maximize the value where and when renewables are needed. The system approach for us is fundamental. It's not just about renewables. It's renewables and energy efficiency. It's optimizing the whole system, optimizing the contribution and the value that renewables bring to the system, as opposed to just fostering one or two technologies. And in this system optimization approach, there is a big role to play for gas. And last but not least, eliminate the market extortion. Create a level playing field. The low oil prices is the right moment where to be serious to introduce a robust and long-term carbon pricing, and it is the right moment where to make further progress in phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for the invitation to be here, to the organizers and sponsors. I'm going to follow up on some of the points that Paulo's discussed in his presentation. See if we can find my presentation on the screen. I want to build on essentially three things, and when the slides do appear, you'll see the 3 points that I want to make. I want to talk about a little bit more about solar and the role that solar plays. I found this nice quote from Thomas Edison, which is sort of the founder perhaps of the industry that we're representing here, saying that if he only had more time, he would have focused on solar, and hopefully that solar would come online before we ran out of coal. So this is a nice quote, I think, that provides this spirit. So my three things that I want to note, and perhaps we can use that also for our panel discussion. One is the rise of solar, and Paulo has already alluded to this. The second is this idea that gas is this ideal marriage candidate for renewables, the sort of Ken and Barbie type ideal marriage. And I think there's some question marks there that we need to address, and it might be Beauty and the Beast. And the third point is then, where is value shifting? Because as we introduce more technology, and as we're introducing solar and renewables, the business model that underlies many of the sort of traditional utilities is actually being pulled out of underneath them. So it's good to think about where is value going to end up in our sector. So in terms of rise of solar, this is a picture that the original title of this slide was Welcome to Terror Dome. And here you see the fuel costs of coal, gas, and oil, and it's compared to the fuel costs of solar. And of course, solar doesn't have a cost, but when you back calculate what it costs to convert solar into power, you can then calculate the sort of energy equivalent cost of solar, and you see this massive drop in less than 5 years. So an 80% decrease, rapidly entering sort of the domain of where sort of our traditional fuels are. And admittedly, this doesn't include sort of the recent oil price declines, but even so, the decline is massive and extremely impressive, and something that I think, if you're in more traditional parts of the power generation business, you should be worried about. And my thesis, and I think Paulo's thesis is the same, is that this will continue because we've been tracking PV module prices since 1980, and every time capacity doubles, there's a 20% cost reduction in PV modules, which you can plot out over time. And if you then take the projections that the IEA has for where solar capacity is going to be in 2020, then you get to under 5 cents per kilowatt hour production costs. And we saw also in this global overview that in many places already in the world, solar PV at a utility scale level competes with coal-fired generation. And by 2020, it'll compete with coal-fired generation in some places with less sun, where I come from, for example, in the Netherlands. But this is very impressive and set to continue. So is gas then the ideal marriage partner for renewables? This is the main proposition, I think, that floats around, that people say, well, we have this intermittent source, wind, solar, doesn't always work when it's dark or when there's no wind, and we need some kind of flexible backup capacity, and gas provides this nice, flexible, you can switch it on rapidly, it's compared to coal and oil, less CO2 intensive, so we would expect gas and renewables to complement each other. And I thought I'd show you what's been happening in Germany for the past 15 years. And Germany is perhaps a good example because this is a country that's expanded rapidly in renewable energy. So they've added 80 gigawatts of renewable capacity in 15 years. And the peak demand on the energy system in Germany is roughly 80 gigawatts. So they've added the whole peak demand of the system. And this is almost 8% growth per annum over 15 years. Extremely impressive what's happened in Germany. But on the graph on the right, you see what CO2 emissions have done in the German market. So this is sort of the CO2 intensity per kilowatt hour that's being produced. And there we only see a marginal decline over the 15-year period. So 1% per annum decrease in the CO2 intensity of the electricity that's being produced. And 80% of the CO2 emissions in Germany still come from coal-fired power plants. And 2/3 of that come from lignite coal-fired power plants. And it's the lignite power plants that are actually very successful in northwestern Europe, also in the Netherlands and also in the UK. So one could question whether gas is the ideal marriage candidate. It might still be, but certainly coal is dancing with the bride at the moment. And why is this happening? Well, of course, oil might, the question is whether this oil price decline will save the day and make gas then also more attractive. And on the left-hand side, you see in the black line what oil prices have done over the past 15, 16 years, decreased rapidly. And oil prices, gas prices, sorry, in the gray line have also declined, have followed this pattern. And gas prices are pretty much back to where they were in 2010. But the dark red line is what coal prices have done. And coal prices have actually declined by 50% over the same period. So gas might have gotten cheaper, but coal has gotten even more cheaper. So the economics work in favor of coal and simply don't work in favor of gas. And on the right-hand side of this graph, we've tried to calculate what kind of CO2 price would we need to make coal and gas at parity, that you wouldn't mind switching from coal to gas because you would be making the same amount of money. And here you see that you need a CO2 price in excess of 35 euros per ton in order for people to switch from coal to gas. So even though gas prices have declined, coal prices have declined even harder, and we don't have a proper CO2 price in place. So I would posit that without some active policy, either through an active and proper CO2 price or a carbon tax, or by stipulating and having regulations in place that limit CO2 emissions, we will find that coal remains a very attractive competitor in this market rather than gas. And in Germany in the past week, there's been a report looking at how can we phase out coal over time. In the Netherlands, where I come from, there are now also big discussions. Should we turn off 4 brand new coal-fired power plants that have just been commissioned in the past year at a cost of 6 billion euros? So there is this discussion happening. But without some active policy discussion, either through a proper CO2 price or policy regulations, coal will remain an attractive fuel and will therefore perhaps steal this beautiful renewable bride that we all wish well. So my final point that I'd like to make is where is the value then shifting when we look across the value chain? And there's a lot of detail on this slide, so I don't expect you to read all of this, but this is a picture that we've drawn for the value chain in sort of mature markets. This might not be applicable so much in growing or less mature markets, but certainly in the USA, OECD countries, Europe. This is a picture of how you could look at the value chain. And moving from left to right, here we see that sort of the large-scale fossil fuel generation, we expect large value declines to happen there. They have already occurred, but this will continue. But renewables will be on the rise as we're actually giving this policy priority. And so we're expecting there to be money to be made there. The traditional business case of these renewables will also change. So that up until now, this was actually functioned like a government bond with all the subsidy schemes. So you would buy in to a government subsidy scheme and earn a nice return with a government-backed bond, as it were. And with the price declines, we actually expect this to become economical and for people to start building these renewables at a merchant level. So we see a sharp decline there on the traditional side of the generation part and an increase on the renewables. Transmission and distribution, there's also a lot happening there. So to accommodate some of these large-scale renewable plants, for example, in Germany, the distribution system operators estimate that they need to expand the grid by over 50%. The transmission system operators are also expanding heavily, connecting offshore wind parks, building large-scale high-voltage connections. But there's not going to be a lot of value there, additional value, because these assets tend to be highly regulated. So there's a regulated return, which is attractive, but there won't be a lot of value addition or creation there. But certainly a very interesting place to be active at the moment as these systems get more complex. Trading and retail, well, we expect value to move away from this part as customers become more in control of their own consumption. There's significant price competition, and as volatility is removed from the market through all these renewables, there's actually less room for active trading and making money off the back of trading. And as we move to the right, so metering and behind the meter, this is where we expect most value growth. And traditionally, this has been where the utilities have stopped. So we enter the house, we have a meter, and that's our cash till essentially. We send a bill, and then we ignore essentially what happens behind this meter because, well, customers don't do anything behind that meter except use this energy. And what we're seeing now is that people are actively managing their own energy. They have electric vehicles, there's distributed generation, solar panels on roofs, storage, home services, etc. And it's in this part of the value chain that we see most value appearing. And it's also in this part of the value chain that traditional utilities haven't been very active. And there's other companies starting to appear that have attractive options. So this might not be equivalent in each and every market, but I think on a whole, this is pretty much the way we see value shifting in the market. Thank you, and I'd like to leave it there and hand over to the chair.